What's up, fans of old junk? So today we're going to be talking about how to convert one of these VW Type 86C Polos and Derbies to rear disc brakes. What I'm going to show you is which components you need. I'm going to show you how to find the specific components you need and just give a couple of tips and pointers as to how to bolt it all together. It's fairly straightforward. And it's so easy, in fact, that it's a wonder to me that VW didn't offer this as a factory option or a factory upgrade for some of the more high-performance models like the G40s. Anyways, let's get right into it. So the first thing that you need is you're going to need an axle stub. So this is basically the piece that connects your wheel to your axle. This one is incredibly important for safety. These could be purchased new, as could all of these other parts. I decided to source them used because they were much cheaper, and they're not all that prone to wear. So basically this axle stub bolts to your axle. I'll show you guys how that works later on. And then here you've got a couple of things that you need to put on. One is a sealing ring that goes around here. Then your roller bearing, which is this one. That's the inner bearing. Then comes your brake rotor, then comes your outer bearing, and then comes the hardware to adjust the bearing. And that's it. That's really it for this piece here. It gets connected to the axle with 4 M10 by 1.5 by 25 millimeter bolts, and they get torqued to 72 Newton meters. You can also use a little bit of Loctite on them just for added safety. It doesn't hurt. So once you have that, then you can put your carrier bracket, this is your carrier bracket right here, you can bolt that to the axle stub, which is then connected to your car, right? So it's a very simple, this is a very simple and great design for a disc brake. It's very maintenance easy. So this bolts together like so. There's two standard M8 by 1.25 bolts in here. I believe they're about 25 millimeters as well. Don't go crazy on these. As far as the torque is concerned, they are inner 6-point. So, you know, if those bolts aren't exactly 100% up to snuff, you're going to have a bear of a time loosening them. You do want to torque them, but I think about 50 Newton meters for these friends should be just fine. Once you have that together, you can put your brake rotor on, and then you can slide your caliper over. So you load your caliper, and loading it means adding these pads. You load your caliper, and you slide it in from the back here, and then this bracket, this is going to sit, one moment please, this is tough to do with one hand. Let's prop that up against that. It's going to sit like so, okay? Does that make sense? So these little bolts, these little M8 guys, they go through here, and then the entire caliper can slide in and out on this assembly. And you want to make sure that if you're going to be using used parts like I am, you want to make sure that these boots aren't torn, and you want to be and you want to make sure that this slides in and out nice and easy. The other thing on the caliper that you want to watch out for, again if it's used, is you want to make sure that this moves. This is your handbrake assembly. I'll talk more about that in just a second. Now the other thing that's incredibly useful when doing this conversion is to have one of these aftermarket Seal Flex lines, and I'll show you why once we take a look at the car. Now there's one thing that you need to get out of your drums, and this is where I recommend just buying new parts. So the way that these bearings work is there's two of them. There's an inner one, that's the bigger one, and then there's an outer one, and the outer one is slightly smaller. And the way that they work is they have these rollers, very simple technology, been around since the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids actually. And they sit in a nice bearing, what's called a bearing race in here. It's a ring of a very finely machined and polished stainless steel surface. Now you need that. And the problem is getting it out of these old drums is not very easy, at least not on these. These are cast by Fabi Bielstein, And again, it's another part that I'm disappointed with in their quality. They've gone considerably downhill over the years, at least from my experience. So if you look over on the rotor, you can see it's got these notches here, right? And you can see the bearing race, you can see the backside of it. So what you do is you take something sturdier than this, obviously. You take a punch and a sledgehammer, and you go in here, and you punch these out. And then they simply fall to the ground, and you take them and you can put them into, the trash if you're replacing them, or you can put them into your new rotor. And it's got the same thing on the reverse. Now on these drums, it only has those notches on one side. So this inner race is impossible to get out. You've got a tiny lip here that goes around the perimeter, but it's not enough to get any sort of purchase for you to punch that out. So do yourself a favor. The inner bearings, just buy them new. Even these bearings I replaced, maybe 3 months ago. So that's why I was going to reuse these. But it turns out these are like $5 a pop, and if you order them online, they're $2.50 a pop for the race and the bearing. They're super universal parts. There's nothing specific to VW about them. All manufacturers use these, and I was able to get them at the local auto parts store, no problem, for, like I said, a couple of bucks. So instead of punching those out or trying to get those out, just replace them. It makes your life a whole lot easier. Now, putting them into the rotor, you're going to need two things. You're going to need, the brace, obviously. You put it in the tapered side. It's tapered like this. I hope you guys can see that angle. Right, so that's the inner side there. What you're going to want is you're going to want a socket that's the same outside diameter as this inside diameter in here. And you put your race in. You tap it in with a plastic hammer around the edges there, and then once it has some purchase and some grab to it, you take a socket. You're right, that's got to be the perfect size. And for the bigger ones, it's a 1.5 inch socket if you're in America, and for the smaller ones on the inside here, it's going to be a 1 1/8 inch socket. I don't know what that works out to in metric, but it doesn't have to be super precise. It's not down to a thousandth of a millimeter or a thousandth of an inch. So you put that in, and then you just take a sledgehammer, you beat on the socket, and that in turn drives this race in. So you do that on both sides, and then you're ready to rock and roll. You can put your rotor with the races and the tapered bearings, goes in here like this. Grease it. If it's a new bearing, grease it. Put your seal cap on it on the inside, and then slide it onto the stub. Once it's on there, put the outside race in. Put the outside bearing in, and then you use this nut to adjust it. And they don't need to be tight. The way that you adjust these is just enough that you can still wiggle this little disc around. That's plenty, right? And then you spin the wheel, you give it a couple of wheels, you give it a couple of spins, and you make sure it doesn't drag or bind or anything, and then you're good. Then you put this little friend on here, and then you've got a cotter pin that gets driven through here like this to keep everything safe and in place. So that's that. Let's see, what else is there to talk about? Oh yeah, dust shields. You want those. There's many reasons to have them. There's not a lot of reasons to not have them. Get yourself a used set, hit it with some spray paint. You can use VHT, very high temperature paint, or you can just use regular spray paint, I think. I don't know, we'll see. I think worst case scenarios is on the racetrack it'll bubble up a little bit, but I can't see that OEM paint for brake dust covers is anything special. So, once we have all that, there's another tool that we need, or a tool set rather, and that's this. This is a disc brake caliper tool set. This one happens to be from AutoZone. And what you're going to want it for is these brake calipers with integrated handbrakes. The way that they work is you've got kind of in the caliper piston, you've got two slots there. And you want to insert one of those adapters in here and then spin it. And you spin it clockwise to move this piston further down. If you're putting in brand new pads, which you should be, then you want this as far in as it can go. Now it takes some force to do this, and it takes that tool to do it. It's not like on the fronts where you can just squeeze it together with a clamp or anything. These have to be spun because there's actually a thread in here. So be mindful of that, and before you get started on this job, go grab that tool set. It makes your life a whole lot easier, and even with the tool, it's not easy to do this on calipers that have been sitting. And these are, we're talking here, these parts are exactly as old as I am. They're from 1990, so they're about 30 years old, and you know, they need some love, and they need some motivation to do things that they don't want to do, just like me. Anyways, other than that, let me show you guys. Oh yeah, let me show you guys the parts catalog. So how do you source these parts? How do you know what fits? So the way that you figure that out is you look at the parts catalog, and the parts catalog abbreviation is ETKA. That's the VW parts catalog, and it's a very complicated German acronym. And basically you click through it until you end up with this screen. This is under wheels and brakes for all the different models, okay? So it's all grouped. You're gonna go to catalog VW, then you're gonna choose the market. I'm in the USA. You choose any given car, any model, and I'll get to why later. Corrado, and you go through the group parts and you find wheels, comma, brakes. Once you're there, you scroll all the way down, and now this is what we're looking for. We are looking for any VW with a Lucas rear 226 by 10 millimeter rear disc brake, okay? Now, when you click that, it opens this screen, and here's a nice diagram to show us all the single parts that we just talked about and how they go together. That's one, very helpful, but it also shows us part numbers. And the way that these part numbers work is the first 3 digits, they describe what model it's part of. So for example, for the Derbies, it's going to be, they're going to start with 861. I know that from experience, whenever I see a part number that starts with 861, I kind of curse under my breath, because it means that I need to order it from Europe. Nothing domestic is going to fit. Then you've got 3 other codes, or 6 other digits. Now these last 6 digits are the important ones. They will dictate if the part is the same across from one model to the other. So there might be, well, I know there isn't in this case because they never built rear brake calipers for the Type 86s. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, you would find a part number 861615423. That would most likely be interchangeable with 1H0, which 1H0 being the Corrado. Okay, so the part numbers you want are 615423, and that is going to be the 226 by 10 millimeter rear disc brake. That will fit under the stock 13-inch wheels, which is what I'm running and what I want to continue to run. In the front, you've got 239 by 20, if it's a G40 specific model, brake assembly. 239 by 20 vented rotors, and then these are going to be 226 by 10. You want smaller rotors in the back than you do in the front, so you have a more balanced braking system. You never ever want to lock up the rear axle. We'll talk about that more a little bit later as well. Now, the other thing that's important is piston diameter. So these brake calipers are made by Girling, and they are 38 millimeters in diameter. The front ones are 48 millimeters. Okay, so that's enough theory. Let's talk about how this works when you put everything together. So like I said, fairly straightforward assembly, and doesn't that just look a million times better? So you've got your rotor, and if you've ever done, if you've ever changed your own brake pads on your car, you know how this goes together. It really is that simple. You've got your floating caliper here, slides in and out. So those are your 2 bolts right there. You've got your bleeder valve. We're going to bleed the system. We have to, obviously, afterwards. And then you've got your caliper bracket. I don't know if you guys can see it. I promise you it's there. Yeah, there's those inner 6-point, those Allen heads. And they're going to bolt it all to the axle stub. And yeah, here's our bearing. That's still missing the grease cap and so on. I'm not 100% finished on this side yet. Now, with these flex lines that are aftermarket, that the DPO, the dreaded previous owner, so thoughtfully provided for us, I can just bolt this right up. If you don't have these, your original brake line is probably going to be too short and you need to extend it. What I like to have on hand for these cars is a set of brake lines for a VW Bug. And the reason for that is you can get those on Amazon shipped anywhere in the world the next day for like $30. Okay, everything's abundantly available for a VW Bug, and they're the same size threads, so you can cut them, you can shorten them, you know, or whatever you need to do to make this fit. And it's a good thing to have on hand when you're working on the brake parts. Now the last thing is my neighbor's annoying lawnmower, is the handbrake cable. And now there's, as you can see here, this, can you see that? Come on, there we go, let me zoom out a little. This isn't gonna work. So this end right here where my thumb is wants to sit in that eyelet right there, and then pull through and attach to that hook right there. But this is too short, so that's not going to work. I'm probably going to end up having somebody extend these cables for me. Now let's talk handbrake cables for a second. There's two different setups for these models. One is what I have here. This is the 1982 model. I don't know when they switched it over, but these are the older style handbrake cables. You're going to have a plastic 360-degree disc on the driver's side that does something. I think it's supposed to balance them, but I found it always unbalances them. Anyways, it's there. That's setup one. That's the earlier style, and I think the switchover is going to be probably 1984. They changed a couple of things on these cars, and then you ended up with different handbrake cables all throughout, because there's two. There's one that goes from this side to the other side, and then there's one that goes to the lever, from the lever to the back. Okay, so those were swapped out in 1984, and the problem is they're not interchangeable. You can't use the newer style handbrake cables with the older style lever, because they did actually change the lever itself. That's problem A. Problem B is that you've got your fuel tank to contend with. The newer style handbrake cables won't clear the older style fuel tank. So that's another thing you need to watch out for. And that's why I think it's just easier to go get this cable extended. And that's probably what I'm going to end up doing. For now, I'm going to be the complete YouTube mechanic about this and zip tie this so it doesn't flop around and drive around without a handbrake for the time being. And knowing me, that'll probably be the provisional solution that I will be driving around with for the next 500 years. Okay, so I think that about covers everything that you need to know for the brake conversion. No, it doesn't. There's one more thing that I just remembered: proportioning. So, as I mentioned, you never, ever, ever want to lock up the rear axle on a car. If you do, you're going to spin, and you cannot win if you spin. Okay, remember that. Put that on a t-shirt. It's important. Now, it's also important safety-wise. So, there's a couple of ways that you can prevent that from happening. You need to limit the maximum pressure that can go into these lines, the ones that go to the rear. And there's two ways to do that. One is to use a load sensing mechanism. So VW has this, it's like a construction of brackets, and it's a proportioning valve that sits on your rear axle. And as your rear axle, because remember this can move like this, right? So as your rear axle gets unloaded, because your car is braking under hard braking, your rear axle is going to be unloaded. The whole front of the car tilts down, and your weight shifts, right? So as that gets unloaded, there's a spring on the proportioning valve that will then close off the valve itself, and will thus limit the amount of pressure to these lines. And it's a brilliant system. It's specifically designed for these cars and for these chassis. It's the best that you can do. However, Polo exclusive parts, nightmare to find. They cost an arm and a leg now, and I was actually dumb enough to throw a set out a couple years ago. So that's one thing you can do. The other thing that you can do, this is your second option, is if we come to the front of the car, I can't really pop the hood right now, but it's super simple. There's two proportioning valves on your master cylinder, and they just screw in to the master cylinder, and then you've got your brake line going into those. And those will do the same thing. They will limit the pressure that can go to the rear axle. Now there's two different setups. There's one for disc drum, and there's one for disc. The disc drum is a 335 valve. So that means I believe this is what it means. There's a residual pressure of 3 bar on the line at all times, and it will cap it at 35 bar. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's how those valves work. And there's the 315 ones. Those are for disc. Those are unfortunately unobtainium. If you can find them, they go for hundreds of dollars, and that's really, really expensive. The third option is to use a universal proportioning valve. Most of the time they're adjustable, so it's a couple of ways that you can adjust them. The most prominent one probably being finding an empty, rainy parking lot and doing some panic stops with different settings on your proportioning valve and having your buddy tell you if you locked up the rears or not. That is most likely the option that I'm going to go for, because if there's one thing I need on this car, it's something else to adjust. Now, that's 20 minutes of me talking. I'm going to bolt this other side together now, and then because with the proportioning, it all comes down to a variety of different factors. What's your engine weight? What's your weight distribution? So on and so forth. So I'm going to put this together and just try it carefully. Anyways, if you don't hear back from me, you'll know that you don't want to use the 335 valves in conjunction with disc. But it might just work. We might get lucky, or we might have to spend another couple bucks to get a proportioning valve that works with this car. But that's half the fun of these hobbies, right? So anyways, I'm going to shut up now, put this together, and then I'll shoot a couple of videos for you guys to show you how it ended up working.